Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today. My name is Gabriela Bocio Santos, and I'm the Associate Director of the Sustainable Solutions Lab at UMass Boston, also known as SIZZLE. SIZZLE is a collaborative research institute focused on climate justice and on keeping historically excluded people and communities safe and healthy as our climate changes. We are a partnership of 6 schools and 4 racial and ethnic institutes, including the College of Education and Human Development, which our moderator, Shadima Ozor-Kammer, and one of our speakers, Megan Kallman, are both part of. As part of the work that we do at SIZZLE, we seek to highlight and lift up the great work of our faculty, students, and staff in our partnership. And the book that we will be discussing today, Building Something Better, Environmental Crises and the Promise of Community Change, is a perfect alignment with our mission. So SIZZLE would like to thank both of our speakers today, Megan Kallman and Stephanie Malin, for being here today, and to Shadima for planning and leading this discussion. I'd also like to remind you and point out that the session is being recorded. The recording will be posted on UMass Boston's YouTube channel, and it will be emailed to all registrants in the next few weeks. If you need captions, you can enable the automatic captions by clicking on the CC Live Transcript button on the bottom of your Zoom window. And now I'm going to hand it over to Shadima. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. My name is Shadima Ozor-Kammer, and I am a part of the Sustainable Solutions Lab, SIZZLE, as well as the School of Global Inclusion and Social Development. I am one of the researchers in these spaces, and so thrilled to be here and so thrilled to have 2 authors, co-authors of Building Something Better, Environmental Crises and the Promise of Community Change, here to have a conversation. And before we get started, so a word, I'm also a licensed clinical social worker. And so a lot of times people think that all of the folks that are on panels know it all, and we're not all learning. And so one of the questions, and we won't kick it off here, but we will get to it, is posed to the authors about what was something surprising or something that you learned during this process of writing this book. And so we're going to put a pin on that and stay on the fact that all of us that are on this panel are learners. And we are perpetual learners. We are students of life. We are students of sociology and other areas of study. And so bearing that in mind, we attempt to stay in terms of the language that's cultural and that is appropriate, and bearing in mind that we may have some missteps, in which case we will quickly kind of follow up with that, make amends and move forward and vow not to do it. And so with that, I think it's also important to acknowledge the land that UMass Boston, University of Massachusetts, Boston is on, because that is some of what we are going to be talking about during this conversation. And so as we live and learn on these territories, we must keep in mind the community struggles for self-determination and colonial legacies of scholarly practices of which we're a part. We acknowledge that the University of Massachusetts Boston is on land that is the original homelands of the, and I may mispronounce it, Mashpee, Wampanoag, Aquinnah, and Nipmuc and Massachusetts tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. And we honor and respect the many diverse Indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. And so I just want us to take just a brief moment to consider what I've just read and acknowledge it and enter this space bearing this in mind. So again, thank you all for being here. We are thrilled to be here. I'm going to pass the proverbial mic to either Professor Megan Kallman or Professor Stephanie Malin. Either one of you, Megan or Stephanie, can introduce yourselves briefly in your own words, and then we will get started on digging into the book.
I can go ahead and introduce myself first because I think Megan's going to talk about our first excerpt. So that would flow pretty well, I think. My name is Stephanie Malin. I'm an associate professor in the sociology department. I wanted to first thank everyone and UMass Boston for hosting this. Thank you, Chidima, for organizing this. You've been a joy to work with, and we are really excited to answer everyone's questions. So yes, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Colorado State. I also co-founded and co-direct the Center for Environmental Justice here, and I do a lot of work in extractive communities that have uranium mining or oil and gas extraction. But starting with this book project, I also work with communities that are building more distributive and regenerative systems, because I think it's so important to understand the drivers and the causes of problems that we face, but then also look at spaces where different models of social organization and economics and all of that are being built. And so I couldn't be more excited to talk about this book and hear from all of you. So thank you again for having us.
Thanks, Stephanie. Megan.
Thank you. Thank you, Chidima, and to the Sustainable Solutions Lab and everybody involved in supporting this event. I'm Megan Kallman. I am an associate professor at the School for Global Inclusion and Social Development. I'm a trained sociologist, which is like relevant to the book, because when Stephanie and I kicked it off, part of what we were doing was very purposefully looking at legacies within our own discipline and how our discipline engages specific things, including the concept of the environment sort of as a construction, ideas of economy, ideas of well-being, how knowledge is produced, by whom, under what circumstances, et cetera. So being a sociologist is actually really core to my identity. And I'm very proud to work in a transdisciplinary program, which in some ways I think has made being a sociologist feel different. And to preview, Chidima asked a really great question at the beginning, which is, I think, going to feed nicely into the first excerpt. But one of my greatest learning experiences throughout the course of this book was to just get some really good detail on what other people are up to and why and how. So, we built out a kind of a framework for asking some questions, and then we asked a bunch of questions, and those things produced insights that look different across different parts of the book, across different communities. But that learning process is, like I can't put it all into one little bullet point, I don't think, but the process of inquiry was a real gift for me in this. And I think it's worth saying that Stephanie and I wrote the first draft of this book, like during the middle of the pandemic lockdown, and we did a lot of our data collection while the whole world was feeling the effects of the COVID pandemic in very, very different ways. And so we wrote it from the throes of like both individual and collective pain in a way that I've never done a writing project before. Seems like that's sort of a preview of what's to come with a lot of climate and political and social instability. That's probably going to be more the norm than less, but that also was an interesting point of vulnerability and trust in some cases, and like real fear and pain in others. So I'm able to start reading. Is that where I should go? Okay. I'm reading from chapter 1 here, and the page number for those folks who have it in the book is between pages 10 and 12, but I'm starting on a subheading called What Seems to Be Working. We spend much of this book sharing examples of how people build something better out of the crises we face. There are a few similarities among the work being done, which we want to outline up front. First, we show how these groups and organizations work to explicitly address and resist neoliberal capitalism. In other words, they very deliberately confront the fundamental tensions and inconsistencies that capitalism generates. While some are semi-professionalized or professionalized, all of these organizations take seriously how neoliberal approaches necessarily subordinate human and non-human species to profit. And they talk openly about it as they counter these effects, making explicit links between their on-the-ground organizing and the larger systems shaping the lives of their communities. They do not avoid talking about it, and they do not pretend it away. Each of our cases highlights this in its own way. More than that, though, these movements explore the intimate relationships between capitalism, class struggles, sexism and racism, colonialism, and ecological destruction, and they make those relationships a core part of their work. This, as well, requires an explicit conversation about systems. Scholars have looked at these relationships for a long time, exploring how capitalism builds upon intersecting, radicalized, racialized, and gendered sets of exploitation. Real organizing, given this, must mean acknowledging the different effects of that neoliberal capitalism has had on people of different races, classes, and genders. The organizations and communities we highlight here take on this challenging, iterative, and complex work, even while building on the ground alternatives. In all of this, identity matters. It always has and it always will. Identity politics are frequently dismissed as outright, as divisive, and often that's because they challenge patriarchal and neoliberal dogma. But individual identities also take on meaning in the collective and historical sense. They mean something because of the systems and structures in which those identities are embedded and through which they are given meaning, context, and power, or not. The cases here acknowledge those multiscalar links and work with them. For instance, and to preview some of our case studies, indigenized energy showcases how to build community-based and community-owned energy systems in the midst of extractive landscapes and histories, and how to do this with intergenerational needs as central priorities. The Hemp and Heritage Farm builds non-extractive regenerative economies that draw on indigenous knowledge systems rooted in the Ojibwe practices of its founder, Thunder Valley Community Development Corporation, Thunder Valley CDC, on Lakota land now referred to as Pine Ridge, South Dakota, also showcases how to build interwoven regenerative systems that allow equitable access to housing, education, and spiritual and other forms of support for communities dealing with systemic poverty. The Havasupai tribal nations fight against running uranium mining's encroachment on water systems vital to their ancestral and current homes shows how non-economic dynamics can be prioritized. Each case then can be described as intersectional, as recognizing the interactive ways that different aspects of people's identities matter. As discussed earlier, an intersectional framework in both organizing and in research is premised on the idea that different systems of oppression are co-produced by and productive of unequal realities. While Kimberly Crenshaw is credited for the term intersectionality and Patricia Hill Collins popularized it, the idea drew upon decades of work by other feminists. These included work by the Combahee River Collective, a Black women's group that articulated a version of intersectionality in 1977, emphasizing, quote, the development of integrated analysis and practice based on the fact that the major systems of oppression are interlocking, end quote. Rather than examining gender, race, class, spatial location, sexuality, age, history, historical data, and nation, to name just a few, as separate systems, an intersectional approach looks at how these systems comprise and complicate one another and the effects that those combined experiences produce in people's lives. Another example illustrates these patterns as relates to our cases. The history of American environmentalism, as presented by many authors until quite recently, was a history of white, upper middle class, male environmental activism. Yet, as Dorceta Taylor has argued for years, this perspective has deprived scholarship of deeper understandings of how environmental experiences are different for people and how those experiences have varied over time. This dominant construction of, quote, the environment emerged from imagery of wild wilderness, wildlife, and themes of recreation, themselves influenced by romanticism and transcendentalism. And this narrow exclusionary account rendered invisible countless other perspectives and normalized one view of the environment and environmental movements. Romantic understandings of the environment differed greatly from, for instance, a history of sharecropping that shaped many Black Americans' experience. Black scholars and activists began to write and speak about environmental issues explicitly in the 1970s by linking them with race and social inequality. And Taylor's work has repeatedly made such connections. This narrow view of the environment also failed to recognize, given its emphasis on ideas like unspoiled wilderness, that indigenous and tribal people and nations in settler colonies were forcibly and violently removed from their ancestral homelands to make room for white settlers and wilderness designations, which also depended on perpetual treaty violations by the US state. Indeed, as other scholars have observed, the losses rendered by settler colonialism necessitate an indigenous environmental justice that recognizes how ongoing inequities extend for more than 500 years of environmental injustices that Native nations have endured. Additionally, many people's experiences of the environment were and frequently are mediated through farm labor. For instance, the United Farm Workers Movement, whose better known organizers include Cesar Chavez, Dolores Huerta, and Jesse Lopez, had its own way of engaging the environment. The mainstream environmental movement also largely failed to recognize or represent how gender-shaped environmental experiences, as people of different genders were frequently separated spatially and occupationally. Each case study presented here then reminds us of the power of intersectional perspectives. Indeed, the communities and organizations that we highlight all clearly demonstrate that good organizing is intersectional because neoliberalism and ecological destruction do not affect all people in the same ways. Any sustainable path to healing must acknowledge this. And the organization whose work we explore also value this as an important sociological reality. Diversity of experience can enrich collective efforts to build something better. Each case's intersectional approaches to community building inform their more redistributive and regenerative efforts. Related, there are clear distinctions in the cases we highlight between organizations and organizing. The groups shared here deliberate explicitly about the trade-offs they make or do not make between creating organizations as stable institutions that pay people salaries and organizing on specific issue campaigns. A great deal of work has shown that formal organizations can have deleterious effects on the orientation and demands of civil society, even as they also become consistent foundations for community work. In other words, the pressures that the nonprofit industrial complex can muffle the breadth of the demands, even while offering stable bases for community-supported work. The case studies we share focus on spaces of organizing that, while sometimes formalized, are clearly not only businesses. Soulfire Farm, for instance, complements its agricultural work with speaking and educational engagement and land rematriation strategies, where Indigenous land is returned to Indigenous peoples and nations. Thunder Valley CDC focuses on spiritually guided community development and healing work alongside the building of affordable housing, designed in traditional Lakota layouts. This dynamic organizing, as opposed to formal organization building, also opens space to build coalitions. Each case study illustrates how organizing work can inform and strengthen organizations by making them more malleable, adaptable, and open to the infusion of new members, partnerships across causes, and changes in course as necessary. Because of this, organizing work, as opposed to organizational work, is also often emotive or effective labor. Across these case studies, we see examples of organizing that is creative, spiritual, based in the evolving needs of diverse communities, and sometimes even funny. Much of this organizing resists the norms of hierarchically organized institutions, which often exacerbate inequalities along the lines of gender, class, race, and ethnicity. There are spaces for different kinds of people and knowledge in these cases, as well as different kinds of expression. And as part of this deep engagement with the stuff of humanity and life, these groups also typically work with well-developed understandings of the synergies between humans and more than humans, between humans and the environment, broadly defined. Among them, natural resources are often treated as relations. One of the groups, Soulfire Farm, counts the land in its farms as a voting member of its decision-making process, for example. Other groups we write about, like the Hemp and Heritage Farm, were founded by Indigenous water protectors who fiercely defend the rights of nature. In other words, these groups elevate that which is most human and to which we can aspire to become human beings while honoring humanity's relationship with more than humans. Across cases, groups strive to see humanity's potential while acknowledging its faults. As discriminatory systems have been institutionalized, the ugliness of inequality, power, state-led violence, power overthinking, and ecological disaster can seem all too real and permanent. The groups we focus on highlight both where humanity is flourishing and where it needs to grow. They call out systems and thinking at fault. They call in potential participants, allies, and accomplices. They highlight how systems of white supremacy, sexism, colonialism, capitalism, extractivism, and speciesism have created current sociological and ecological disasters. They talk about why these systems need to be dismantled, and soon, if people are to build other systems that can contend with the climate crisis and the massive inequality and the disastrous outcomes of racialized capitalism and patriarchal systems. And just as importantly, they underscore that these sad systems are not the only fruits of humankind, that there can be richness and humility and cooperation, connection, respect, and love in what people do and create. Each of these groups also works to heal the deep social wounds inflicted by patriarchal systems, systems where men hold power, privilege, respect, and often control over property and lineage. Like racism, patriarchy and sexism are deeply embedded, and they show up in the very blueprints of polity, organizing schools, jobs. Patriarchy, capitalism, and colonial regimes have often intersected, and they have tended to erase or subsume other systems. For instance, the matrilineal approaches of some of the cultures we examine in our case studies were all but decimated by the patriarchal systems, which, like racial hierarchies, tend to overtake other ways of being, right down to the language that people use to describe their daily experiences. The groups we highlight here acknowledge this, and they shape their organizing around resisting it. Because of this clear-headed perspective about what humans are and can be and what they are not, these movements also have a serious engagement with context, social and environmental. whether that context is a city, a neighborhood, a university, an industry, the land they cultivate, or even just the street. The groups in our case studies are deeply connected to and intentional about place. They strive to be grounded in the needs and experiences of their environments, including humans, more than humans, land, water. And while they include abstract critiques of like capitalism, for instance, those critiques get their weight from the lived, grounded experiences of the people themselves. A great many of these organizations are also intergenerational, which matters conceptually as well as practically. When you think about the future, you have to reflect on who you expect will be alive and what they will need. And this can change the calculations in the present. The movements we highlight in some of our cases, from the youth-led campus divestment organizations to the Society of Fearless Grandmothers, explicitly adhere to intergenerational ethics. These groups see humanity in a complex web of more than humans ecosystems and countless generations before and after those currently here. They model how to take the long view with well-being as the central goal. And finally, all of these groups have an active recognition of both the structural and the personal. Some of them, like Soulfire Farm, explicitly talk about that link between structure and agency. These groups have a systemic views on big social issues, understanding their historical roots and their institutional forces, but they also offer lessons in how to use individual and community agency to actively change those systems. Systems can feel so daunting because they are often so hard to see, and individual people within them can feel so powerless, so small and inept. But once we recognize structure, and once we see that systems that hold power over, we gain insights into how to change them. I'm going to stop there.
Thanks so much, Megan. So there was a lot in there, and I really like how you all frame, especially following along at home or wherever you are today, with what seems to be working in the italicized parts, because you all mentioned intersectionality. You talk about competing, Megan knows this from my own writing, layerings of social identities, right? Just competing priorities almost within the same person and their social identities, along with looking at things that are almost foregone conclusions. So you all are sociologists and you are trained to rip things apart or look, find the flaws in the foundation and the cracks in the foundation, so to speak. And in this book, while you did do some of that, you took a different approach and you did look at what was working and you illuminated and amplified voices and perspectives that haven't typically been amplified and illuminated. So thinking about that and what you just read, one of the questions that I would like us to start with is, how were you all able to overcome any fixed mindsets that you had, and what worked in terms of shifting paradigms, as well as what can work for those of us that are tuning in, for the communities in which we're a part of? How can we do the work to kind of shift these paradigms, move away from systems? Neoliberalism is one of the main systems that you all critique, or certainly talk about in this book. And so what worked within you all's own scholarship, but then also how do we take that and move with it in terms of our own communities and the spaces in which we hold space in these conversations?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a go at that, Megan, since you just read like half of our first chapter. Thank you so much for doing that. I appreciate that. So I will just say that I think that I really enjoyed the approach that Megan and I took in selecting cases, but then also kind of analyzing what they're doing themselves and then how they fit together, right? Because and Megan really brought this perspective to the table, I would say, in terms of like naming it, but this idea of the believing game, right? This idea that we talk about, that we're going to suspend that kind of, I would say, chronic criticism that sociologists can be trained to do and can be guilty of, where we tend to kind of critique everything that might be unsound within an organization or a structure. And instead of that, we really wanted to focus on, like you had said, right, what is actually working, and instead of critiquing all the things that could go wrong or things that might not be 100% in terms of social organization, just highlighting what is working and why it's working in that place and at that scale. And it was incredibly refreshing for me as a scholar. I think we spend so much time not only in our work, but I've noticed in myself, at least, that mindset kind of permeates a lot of my interaction with the world around me, right? Like if it's not 100% in the direction of being distributive or regenerative, then it's so easy to dismiss. But we miss a lot of the good stuff, and nothing that's created by human beings is going to be perfect at 100%, right? So that expectation, or always having those critical glasses on, I think robs us of seeing opportunity, but also the joy in connecting with folks around us. And I think that was, for me, it felt very vulnerable to do that, right? Because I think it opens us up to critique as social scientists from other social scientists, but it felt more true to what we were trying to observe and the stories that we were telling. Because people that we worked with and the cases that we highlighted, they were very reflexive, in my experience, reflexive and honest about where they were strong, where they had opportunities for growth, and that only makes them better, right? And more, I would say, more able to pivot and actually address and respond to some of the difficulties that we face, as well as, growing as organizations in a way that doesn't stifle that growth. And when we talked about the differences between organizations and organizing, I think that's where we see that malleability, that reflexivity makes them much more akin to active organizing than these kind of solid organizations that have to stick with a certain mission or a certain set of goals. I hope that starts to answer the question.
Can I jump in there for a second? So this idea of the believing game, like it has a philosophical underpinning that's long, but the argument there is that you can also strengthen your logic by choosing to believe something fully for, whether that's a discrete period of time or permanently, but like it's only sort of by going whole hog into believing something that you can notice where its strengths are and also potentially where its weaknesses are, right? Like it's as valid a way of checking your logic as skepticism is. I think it has the benefit, though, of helping us be nicer humans and more collaborative humans. I mean, I guess the other thing at the very beginning, like, how does one overcome fixed mindsets? I mean, this is a practice, and I think it's a place too where we have institutions that are better or worse at calling forth those angels. But for me, as a scholar, one of the first ways that I do that is by asking questions in as open-ended a fashion as possible, so that people can answer those questions in whatever way really makes sense to them. And so, and I teach classes in, dissertation proposal classes and in, academic writing. And a lot of what we talk about there is like, how do you ask a question that is not a leading question, that is a question that enables and supports people in answering it on their own terms? And what can you learn from that? And so I do think that starting with questions is, at least for me, a useful strategy for asking me to because it happens very frequently that I ask a question and somebody answers it in a way that was not at all as I'd conceived of the question. And sometimes that means we have to find some shared understanding, but more often than not, it's because they've blown my mind in a way that I didn't think it was going to be blown. And then as regards the second things for creating paradigm shifts slowly but surely, I think there's sort of two broad ways to think about it, right? This book focuses primarily on community-sized efforts and community-based efforts. And often you see community efforts bubbling up, particularly in oppressive systems, because institutions aren't meeting community members' needs. So you sort of build your own, right? But I do think the first thing that we need to overcome here in part of the neoliberal ethic is that the individual human is extremely powerful. And that, I think, is the first big hump to get over. That, so you experience the challenges of climate crisis, you experience the challenges of alienation, sadness, all of those things are sort of experienced on the human level, but we are part of on the individual level often. but we are part of collective systems. And so like, for me, step number one is, who do you have, right? Who is this your running club, right? Is this your student, group? Is this your union? Is this your, who is there with you? Is this your faith group? Is this, who are your collectives? And how do we get there? That seems to me like thing number one. And we all have collectives to which we belong. It's sort of an exercise in thinking through who those are. But every person is a member of multiple collectives. And sometimes I think we like the muscle that is most atrophied is thinking of ourselves in community. And it's atrophied in part because there are these big sort of pressures bearing down upon us to make us think of ourselves as individuals who's like the sum total of our political powers, buying a Prius or changing our light bulbs or something like that. But that's not, that's not political leverage. That's consumption level leverage. So who are our groups? Political action is based on group action. Community action is also based on group action. All of those things require more than one person.
Absolutely. That is so helpful to frame. There was a section that you all can't see it, but I actually, in preparing for, I was doing my homework, y'all, because I understood the assignment was to make sure that I read this book, right? And one of the things, so on page 87, if you're following along, I think the chapter is, I'll have to see what chapter it is. Human beings, not humans buying. I love alliteration and I like kind of that playful nature. So in the middle of the page, it says we wouldn't have a problem of less privileged people if there wasn't an issue of everyone caring about themselves. And everyone trying to generate more wealth. The problem is that the rich want to get richer at the expense of those who are already poor. And that's a very big problem. I believe that if we had communities where the government cared about everyone's well-being, ... So this was Vanessa Nakate, I believe, and she is one of the climate warriors, climate justice warriors, young, 22, and was, if you remember, she is a Ugandan woman, and she was cut out of a photograph by the AP, the Associated Press. And so at the time, Greta was in front of everyone's face. And she is, I think, was 16, maybe 18 at the time, young, white. And Vanessa is not. And so she's a Black woman. And I appreciated in this book, I mean, one of my social identities that's the most salient is that I'm a Black woman. And that's how I read, and that's how I'm perceived, and that's how I identify. And so a lot of these case studies, y'all, if you haven't gotten a chance to pick up this book, please do. I was sad that there was no audiobook. So maybe we'll have to start a GoFundMe campaign or something to get the Megan and Stephanie to read it for those that prefer audiobooks. So I appreciated that a lot of these case studies were focused on folks that look like me, right? Or are not the typical. So in this country, in the US, a lot of the folks that we think are doing climate work, climate justice work, we oftentimes, and so I say we kind of, we think it's white people at the forefront. And really what Megan and Stephanie have done is peel back, the back door, right? And pulled back the curtains to say, actually, a lot of these other folks are doing, not other to other, but like a lot of folks are doing this work, and that's just part of who they are. They call themselves water protectors, and they were born to do this, right? It wasn't something they signed up for. And it's folks from all different generations. So we have youth, very young people, and we have all the way to grandmothers in particular. We have all different colors of skin tone, melanated and less so, represented in this book. And so thinking about that, when we think about climate change, one question that people want to know is how to best push back on claims that the work of dismantling oppressive systems is counter to the pursuits of communities, but also academic inquiry, specifically looking at the cases that do work, and why they're working for folks that maybe haven't gotten an opportunity to read this book. How do we push back on this work of dismantling oppressive systems?
I can take a first crack at part of that. And I'm gonna aim squarely at the social sciences first here, which is that I think as a faculty member, as a scholar, as a sociologist, and also, by the way, I forgot to say at the beginning, I'm a state senator in Rhode Island. So I am in a nearly full-time policymaking role, as well as being in a full-time research role. So I do say this from like a position of doing that work too, that everybody has biases, and that is an inherent part of being a human being. And our responsibility in academic scholarship and as human beings is to be attentive to those, to work with them, to try to diminish them. But we cannot ever get out of our own identities. There is no such thing as an objective human experience. It doesn't exist because there are too many different experiences of humanity to be able to average that out. Not that we would want to, right? And so taking ownership for where we're coming from, this is an idea that in sociology is called reflexivity. But it's like looking at where you're coming from, looking at what you're bringing into the room, looking at how that interacts with what other people are bringing into the room, having a really active and self-reflective discourse about our values, how we pick things, right? So I think it's nonsense to argue that, I don't know, organizational theory, which is sort of my home base, is objective, because it's not, right? We studied certain types of organizations over certain periods of time, like, and sort of happily extrapolated the insights from a particular type of organization in a particular moment of history, and we claim that those apply everywhere. They don't, right? It doesn't mean it's bad or not worthwhile scholarship. It just means that the scholarship is very contextual. There's a lot of things that are contextual. There is a practice, I think, for us in us scholars generally, but also policymakers, and sort of thinking about what experiences are shared enough that we need to develop a shared language about it, and where we need to listen to experiences of others that are different from us, and create systems that, you know, make space for all of that. I experience being a woman in a particular way. I'm willing to bet it's quite different than how Chidima experiences it for a number of different reasons. You know, what parts of us have some synergy? What types of laws, what types of policies, what types of education can support and nurture both of us, while also making spaces for the ways in which we're different? Like, that seems to me like the project. But I do not think this is a problem that gets better by pretending it away. And I will say that, you know, I'm a data scientist, I'm a sociologist. I believe that data is worthwhile, and I believe it's interesting, and I spend a lot of my life gathering it and using it. I will say that there is a sort of sense out there that qualitative and quantitative data are like differently noble or differently objective, right? The only difference is that one is coded into numbers and the other is coded into text. That is the difference, right? Data is gathered by human beings with human frameworks, human proclivities, human orientations, human interests. All of that is fine. That's not bad. It just means we need to work very consciously with that, right? And, you know, so I read and produce both qualitative and quantitative data. I think both of them give me different insights. They have different strengths. But what I do not think is the good move is to think about one type of data as inherently less biased or more objective than the other. I mean, there's a bunch of good stuff out there. There's a documentary actually called Coded Bias, which is an interesting exploration of how, you know, big data has human bias reflected in it. It's just what it is. So I think what that points us towards are systems of self and collective accountability about what we're studying and how, spaces for institutions that are both like hold some sort of tensegrity, right? Some ability to accommodate and meet the needs of groups of people, acknowledging those similarities, but also spacious enough that they can move because we don't all have the same experiences. I'm going to stop there. I've been talking for a while.
No, it's wonderful. And I just want to tag on to that a little bit from the perspective of someone who works at a land grant university, right? With all of its troubled history, but noble vision for how we can actually, in relationship to our discussion at the beginning, right? And acknowledging the land that was stolen on which we have built our institution and many other institutions and everything in a settler colony like the United States, right? We have to, in my mind, as a public sociologist working within an institution like that Colorado State University is, it's my job to make sure that academic inquiry is dismantling oppressive systems, right? And that the goal of collecting data and analyzing it and writing articles is not to have a bunch of peer-reviewed articles, but to make sure that that research and that data is translated in a way that makes it useful to everyone in the state of Colorado and beyond, right? So my goal as a researcher is to kind of see those things as not counter to each other, but to make sure that the academic inquiry that I'm doing is explicitly focused on being as community-based as possible. So I'm addressing the questions that folks want to know about. I like I said, I work a lot in extractive industries, right? And their impacts on the communities that host them. So I do a lot of work. I'm doing a study right now that's deeply community-based on the Suncor oil refinery outside of Denver. It's in Commerce City, which is one of the most polluted zip codes. They live in one of the most polluted zip codes in the United States. And it's been an incredibly long study because we have, from the grant application forward, we have worked with Cultivando, other community partners, and community themselves to figure out why do you want to get this money? How can we help? And what can we ask to make your lives better in the long run, right? So to me, academic inquiry is all about that. And Megan brings up a really important point that we push back all the time against these even co-researchers on the team who are taking like air quality samples or who are doing quote unquote hard science, right? Which has its own set of layered biases, as Megan very importantly pointed out. One of the first questions I get from these trained scientists is, well, how do you account for bias in the questions you're asking and the way you're designing the study? And it makes you just want to be like, oh my goodness, if even my colleagues are asking this question, right? We've got a long way to go, but I'm excited to address that. And I think that one of the best ways that I know how to do this is to keep my mantra since being a graduate student is from Kristen Schrader-Frechette, she's a philosopher, but also a social scientist, and talks about how you can be objective without being neutral. And while I totally agree that pure objectivity is not the goal and it's not possible, I think that when we're talking to critics of research that's more, that is a bit more critical itself, right? And looking at deconstructing these systems, that's kind of the way that we think about and talk about this, right? That what we find when I do work in environmental justice and health impacts of living near oil refineries, for example, I cannot collect that data and analyze it and be neutral about it, right? I can be very, very scientific in the way that I analyze the data and share it, but there are incredibly important human things that are happening, like children getting sick or elderly populations being vulnerable to health impacts. And it would be irresponsible and, in my opinion, immoral as a researcher to just let that stop at a peer-reviewed journal article, right? It's my job to translate that into something that makes meaning for policymakers and for the communities that I work with. So in my mind, it's the goal and the major point of academic research is to instigate social change. And we can do that in a really responsible but responsive way as well.
Thank you so much, both of you. So there was a question that we're going to answer live. So I've been dropping the questions in the chat for folks to follow along with us, as well as excerpts. So the question that I'm pushing to the top, are the authors considering publishing a Spanish translation of the book?
Don't know. So this is maybe a moment at which we could share a tiny bit about how academic publishing works, because it's kind of a weird world. Most academic presses are nonprofit, so the books tend to be expensive because they rely on labor that needs a peer review. This book went through what's called blind peer review. So somebody who you don't know looks at a book. Usually books have 2 or 3 of those reviewers. The editor, in function of what those peer reviewers have said, decides whether whether the book is going to be published, going to be moved forward. The short answer is I would love to have this book in like 5 or 6 different languages. The slightly longer answer is that's a financial decision that lies primarily between how well the book is doing, the press, and us. And I think it points at some like larger structural issues with how academic labor is compensated or not, and what is valued in there. But the short answer is TBD. And I think it probably depends on how well it does in English. And by well, I think how many copies it sells.
Sure. Thank you. That's helpful. So wanted to kind of direct us, because I know folks will want to know kind of what can I do with this information? And how can I be a change maker where I am? One of my dear girlfriends says, lead from the seat you're in. And so there are a couple of questions that I'm going to kind of put back to back, and first kind of do a slight excerpt. So we might, y'all, thank you for rolling with us. We're just kind of having a conversation and just flowing. So on page 67, Failing People in the Planet, there is a bit on neoliberalism, everyone's favorite. And so it's at the very bottom of the page. Neoliberalism's cultural power then derives from mainstream, in parentheses, white, Americans' active and often eager participation in the same system that disenfranchises and alienates so many who participate in the system. And so that stood out. It's one of my folded over corner pages. And I even emailed Stephanie and Megan about this because it made me think about a podcast that I recently listened to. So if you all haven't listened to it, this is a little bit of homework. You didn't know you would come to the table and get some homework assignments, always the educator. So Nice White Parents, it's a New York Times podcast through Serial. And so what the broad sense of that is, it's looking at a Brooklyn middle school and what happened when white nice parents got involved, right? And so this sentence was such a gold, like a piece of gold, because I'm like, yes, this is exactly what tends to happen in this country. When white people get involved in something, whatever the something is, what happens, and who gets pushed aside, who's alienated, who's marginalized, et cetera. And so there are a couple of questions, folks, that I'm going to kind of read back to back. So to Stephanie and Megan, what are your thoughts about the biggest challenges for individuals as they start to plot their own Changemaker course, especially if it's within the space of neoliberalism and other systems, right? Because a lot of times we say, oh, the system's broken, the system's broken, the system's broken. Well, guess what, folks? We are all part of systems, so what can we do if we want to kind of push back on that or be change makers? What is the best way to communicate about climate change in a way that resonates with varied audiences? And so I think we're realizing, given COVID-19, given the racial tension and increased awareness of anti-Black violence in this country, certainly anti-Asian, APIDA, AAPI violence as well, and racism, that, the way in which we used to talk to one another isn't working. And so what can we do about that? And what are the most authentic strategies for primarily white organizations to contribute to change in the environmental justice community? So that was a mouthful. I'm gonna mute and toss the mic back to you all, and then I will include the excerpt or the sentence in the chat.
Thanks. I can take a quick start at this by going from, I think, the second to the third to the first question. The best way to communicate about climate change that resonates with varied audiences, I don't think that exists. I think the whole point is that climate change is experienced differently by different people. And so I think we do ourselves a tremendous disservice by assuming that there is one message that's going to land the same on all of us, because I don't believe that to be the case. And more importantly, climate communicators, scholars who actually study this stuff also don't believe that to be the case. And then sort of related to the strategies for white organizations and in EJ communities, I think one of them, again, I'm not going to argue that there's a most authentic way, right? Everybody's authenticity looks different and all of that kind of stuff. And but I do think that one of the ways that climate expresses is like through language that is not climate based, right? There are all kinds of other descriptors that are used in all kinds of different spaces, often in non-white spaces, but often in working class spaces that may include white people, that have to do with climate that are not like climate change, right? Climate change is a mainstream white environmentalist movement kind of word. Doesn't make it wrong, but it does mean that it focuses attention on like one very specific slice of the problem. And climate change expresses, or environmental degradation expresses in lots of different ways, depending on who you are, right? There's a part of Providence where the asthma rates are quadruple the time that's like, it's a primarily Black neighborhood on the edge of the port of Providence. And the asthma rates are astronomically higher than like 2.5 miles away in the middle class neighborhood. That's a climate issue, right? But we're talking about asthma rates. The point is just that like the issue travels under a different flag, depending on where you are and who you are and what you're facing. And right, so I think thing number one is to, the EJ movement is, I think it's a good, a better term maybe than the climate movement. But also just like that, the movement is maybe, it's an umbrella under which lots of people have, again, a lot of different experiences. So I think like, being insistent about like, this is the climate movement, and therefore if you're worried about asthma, you don't belong because that's actually like a pollution issue. That strikes me as like not a good answer. Again, though, as a white person in a white supremacist set of structures, right? One of the things that my job is to do is to like listen to feedback about what the useful way is to be supportive. And so I think, again, I will slide back to the thing that I said before, which is start with a question and then be willing to answer it or listen to the answer. And then around the biggest challenges for individuals, I often think of this still as like getting together. I think the challenge is moving from seeing ourselves as individuals to seeing ourselves as members of communities, or sort of reimagining how those community connections can look. Because like climate change sort of dwarfs us in its scale. And that's Stephanie and I actually have a new article about where we described how the fossil fuel companies are actually doing that on purpose, right? Like they try to make you as an individual, like you, Chidima, your carbon footprint is X, and therefore you must be a terrible environmentalist. And, why don't you go home and stare at your feet rather than organize, right? So I think the point is to like, how can we support each other in looking up from our feet and looking around to each other? That is where the levers are.
Yeah, I think I want to add to that by saying that I think that along with this idea of hyper individualization, right? I mean, the second half of the book is all about how these different groups are dismantling various pillars of neoliberalism, right? From the hyper individualization and hyper consumption of activism and just daily life, to thinking about spaces as being more communal and less privatized, to reinstituting rules, right, around decency, but also just how do we think about the environment, and how do we think about interactions with one another? And so people often, right, when you're talking about these systems, neoliberalism or the industrial systems that have created a lot of the climate change issues that we're looking at, I think what I've encountered, especially in teaching college students, right, and in doing a lot of leadership summits and things like that with folks who are in high school and middle school, is that there's this deep sense of dread. There's this deep sense of what's being called eco grief or climate grief more and more. And it's real, and it is salient, especially in folks who are children, right? Who are adolescents, who are in their early 20s, and who are the future of, and often major players already in these movements. And that kind of feeling of paralysis and grief, which is so tied to what Megan just talked about, us discussing in our in that article, and other folks like Naomi Oreskes have done work on this in terms of the paralysis that can come about with what we face collectively, and this feeling of how can I take this on as an individual, right? So the importance of, and we talk about active hope from Joanna Macy and Chris Johnston a bit in the conclusion of our book, this idea of, you know, having to have that kind of sense that you can become and are part of a collective, and how to recognize that, how to train yourself to see that, because we're so socialized, especially in systems like and cultures like the US, to see ourselves as individuals. That's one of the major projects of neoliberalism, right, is to disempower by lifting up the narrative of the powerful individual, but then really doubling down on the fact that most of us don't have any power to change these systems, and pushing back on that as much as possible. And I think that one way that I've tried to do that is holding as many forums as I can through our Center for EJ, and in collaboration with the school districts in the town where I live, to have conversations with folks who, especially folks who are in high school, about why do you feel stuck, where do you feel stuck, and how can we help you start to recognize the collectives of which you're a part, especially the fact that you're sitting in a room with 50 other people who are feeling this as well, right? And using that sense of paralysis to kind of shake free of that and have some active hope. And of course, that doesn't mean this unbridled optimism or kind of this blind optimism, but this idea that if we try, we can make things better. And that's going to look different for everyone, right? Where you are in that collective and what that means. Ayanna Johnson has, I'm sure you're all familiar with it, but her climate action Venn diagram I have found to be so useful. And I was going to see if I can post that in the chat. It's just going to the host and panelists, but this idea of recognizing what you can do. And Shadima, you had mentioned at the beginning, right? Helping people from where you sit. I'm butchering what you said, but it's part of that, right? This idea of realizing, like, or trying to assess what brings you joy, what are you good at, what work needs doing, especially in this realm of environmental and climate justice, and then where those things meet, right in the center of that Venn diagram is your climate action and what you can kind of bring. And again, it's not just about climate, it's about environmental justice and climate justice more broadly, right? But I think that visual kind of pictures of where we can go, or that sort of thing, gives people a path forward. And once you can start charting that, you can learn how to become part of a collective, and even how your individual actions don't have to be voting with your dollar or calculating your carbon footprints, right, that BP helped develop the tool for, but instead saying, this is how my individual action can contribute to something more collective and bigger, and can also bring me joy at the same time, right? Because this is something I love doing and it's needed. And so I try to look for as many tools as I can to help give people those platforms to talk about and do what makes them happy, and let them see how that's part of the solution.
Awesome, thank you. So someone's very enthusiastic to get the book. So they said, can't wait to get the book. The idea of identifying our collectives and communities is so empowering. Thank you for the message and reminder. So the question is, can you let us know what the new article is, where it's published, the one that was just mentioned?
Of course, it's in Social Problems, and it was just published at the beginning of this year, so from 2022. Shadima, I would be happy to try to share a copy with you,
Awesome.
and then we can just, we shouldn't
distribute
announce this, but we could distribute it, right?
As
so
we
that folks
can.
actually have
Absolutely.
access to it.
It's the homework that we assigned on this call. So yes, we will distribute it as a follow-up bundle because we're in community right now, right? So this time will never be replicated. So we are sharing space with one another, and we are connected here. And so it's our pleasure. So yeah, that's what we're gonna do. We're just gonna follow up, and we're gonna smash neoliberalism and
I love it. Yes.
Some of the rules.
And all the
Megan knows
paywalls.
I'm a rule breaker. I have a t-shirt that one of my another dear girlfriend gave to me, and it says rule breaker. And then now I have Joy Drop, aka our daughter, and my friend's mom gave her the same t-shirt that says rule breaker. So we are going to rock our rule breaker shirts together. All right, friends. So we are at 2:03 p.m. Eastern. We are closing out at 2:30. So in about 10 minutes or so, Stephanie is going to take us away with kind of some closing thoughts from the book. And then I do have a couple of questions to close us out after that. In the meantime, though, we have one that is about the author's views on environmental or ecological justice and the broader social justice conversation. And then wanted to also have some local connection. So someone realized that Megan and I are kind of, we might not physically be in Boston, but we're definitely connected to Boston. And so folks wanted to highlight that. And so the next question is about local action. So you all, this work, what does it mean for Boston and responding to climate change? One of the things you mentioned, Megan, and this is something that I do in my own DEI work, having my own consulting firm, is folks will talk about there is a deep connection between like asthma within the Black community. And then we think about COVID-19, especially now that we're learning more about long COVID and the implications for folks that were already vulnerable to asthma and other lung capacity issues, and then COVID. And then also George Floyd, the last thing he uttered was, "I can't breathe," right? And he called out for his mother who's deceased. And Eric Garner 6 years before that said, "I can't breathe." And so there is a connection there when we are talking about breath, land, the implications of waste and dumping it in places that people live, people who are those people, not us, not people who look like us. And so where are we in this conversation when we think about environmental and ecological justice and the broader social justice conversation, and then bringing it to a local space? And so it could be wherever we are, really, but certainly Boston, because we're in UMass Boston, or we're kind of in this space together. What does this mean for Boston in responding to climate change?
Yeah. So the word that comes up, Chidima, when you're talking is around sacrifice zones, which is, I don't actually even know the origin of the term, but it basically refers to like places or people that are considered expendable. And they tend to be people who have less power, right? And who that is sort of changes depending on context. But sacrifice zones are not, I do not want to live in a world where we have sacrifice zones. And that actually includes dumps, right? That is a sacrifice zone of like a piece of land where we put our garbage. And that's not an acceptable outcome to me. Rhode Island, I know this is a question about Boston, but I'm going to talk about a Rhode Island example because I think it's good. We went through a really tough time in the last year or two where there were some like big contentious siting issues. We're trying to put an LNG facility in the same neighborhood that I alluded to before. And then there was a state board that sort of refused to vote against it because they did not have social justice in their board's mandate, right? So it was like a pretty narrow interpretation of the law. And because the law didn't say we have to consider human and environmental health, we just sort of have to consider, all these other things. We can sort of find it in our legal experiences and our legal opinions to support this project. Which resulted in a move in Rhode Island to codify environmental justice zones, which is what they wound up being called in the law, which is looking at a place that has historically been treated as a sacrifice zone and saying, no, this is an environmental justice zone, which A, means that it's protected from siting issues, and B, that it's a priority for things like infrastructure dollars, et cetera. So I bring that up just as an example of what one state, and it was a long battle, and there is some real credit to be given, I would say, particularly to the chair of the Environment Committee, whose name is, she's a woman named Dawn Oyer, But exactly, so Flint water crisis, that's from a little bit. I mean, we can fix some of these things within the purview of existing institutions and laws, right? So I think that is one take home that really matters. You know, people in New England live in states that are small. Governments are relatively accessible, even geographically. Like, no one in Rhode Island lives longer than about 50 minutes away from the State House, which can be long enough if you don't have a car or transit or whatever, but it's like not 4 hours or 11 hours if you live in Texas. And so if you are in New England, I think, you know, state policy and state protections are one of, and even city level protections are one of the places where we can look to remedy some of the most egregious outcomes of the legal and institutional system as it has existed throughout the last 200 and change years, right? Like, so something like an environmental justice zone I think that's a meaningful and worthwhile thing to do. That's also something that, like, you know, if Boston were to look, again, I'm not really sure what the state of play is in Boston with something like that, but you know, Rhode Island just looked at that and we're like, you know, not only is this not acceptable, but we can probably do better in terms of directing resources and energy there. Does that fix environmental racism? Absolutely not. But does it give it a sort of institutional bulwark? Yes, I would argue that it does. And it makes, like, future sightings, like, how can we, you know, these kinds of institutional changes are slow and sometimes they're boring. Like, they're hard to see. They maybe don't seem that, the good work isn't always super sexy. So that's the other thing I would say, is that, like, a lot of this stuff is a slog. There's actually a great book by a woman named Francesca Paletto called Freedom is an Endless Meeting, which neatly captures some of the challenges of community organizing. But I digress. So that I think there are, like, I think the first step is, like, what are the local struggles? And what are the local struggles in your community, however you define that, right? Is that a community defined by a faith network? Is that a community defined by neighborhood? Is that a community defined by a city? Is that a community defined by a shared ethnicity? Like, whatever that is. What do you got going there, and what's happening there? I mean, again, I can't stress enough the idea that like the collective is the starting point, and those collectives can look a lot of different ways. Also, no sacrifice zones ever. Like, we need a world without that.
Yeah, I would just like to offer the idea that I think I don't want to equate social justice and environmental justice, because we can think about them and talk about them separately. But I do think as an environmental justice scholar and activist, that what I think is really useful about that set of paradigms, right, is that it gives us some specific tools that are malleable, that work at different scales and in different settings, to think about how we make decisions and how we organize ourselves collectively, right? And we often think in terms of environmental injustice about those kinds of sacrifice zones that Megan mentioned, these instances of distributive injustice, right? Which is, where are the bad things like pollution and contamination and health problems related to them, and who's disproportionately affected? Where are the good things, right? Like clean air, clean water, public transportation, and who has access to those or not, and why? But the big question that environmental justice begs of us, right, is asking the why. And that's not distributive justice or injustice, right? That's all about procedural equity and procedural injustice or justice. And once I kind of appreciated that component of EJ, I realized, and beyond that, right, so distributive, procedural equity, recognition or recognitional justice or equity, and also restorative justice. And we talk about elements of those throughout the book, but what I appreciate about that framework is that it really links to various social justice causes, because it gives us that framework to think about all those different components. And I highlight the procedural justice, and recognition justice goes hand in hand, right? Because whom we recognize as being valuable enough to have a seat at the table really matters in terms of what procedural equity or inequity looks like. And oftentimes what we see is that those sacrifice zones took shape because the disempowered folks are disempowered in these situations. They don't have seats at the table. They never construct the table and invite others to it because of these inequities that are so seemingly so powerful, right? But it's that discussion about who constructs the table, who invites others to it, and discussions around Indigenous environmental justice by Dina Gilio Whitaker, Kyle White, many, many other scholars that we cite in this book. I wish I could name all of them. Remind us that the initial environmental injustices in the context of colonialism and imperialism began 500 or 600 plus years ago, right? These initial separations of people from their land, and not there in a possessive sense, but there in a collective familial sense, right? This is part of people's identities and cultures' identities and intergenerational awareness, and that initial violent and prolonged separation across settler colonies and in different contexts in any kind of colony you talk about really drive a lot of the inequities that we're looking at now. And so when I work with Native nations and Pueblos in New Mexico, for example, some of their biggest points are that it's not about consultation, it's not about inviting us to the table. We need to construct the table, right? And ask and set up the questions that are being asked and the policies that are being discussed and invite others to it. And so I give this example because I think that it lays out for us ways that social change work and social justice work can be done in paying attention to that process. And as Megan mentioned, right, that's the part that can, like when I teach my environmental justice students about zoning, like we're really going to talk about zoning today. It just sounds so unglamorous and boring, but really this is where you understand the dynamics of how things got the way they are. And so I see social justice and environmental justice as so intertwined that they're impossible to break apart. And I do think that EJ does it always work? No, but there are some great examples and ideas for how to think in a multi-scalar and multi-dimensional way about what justice looks like and how you can make the structures that get us there.
Yeah, that's so helpful in thinking about it. So we are nearing the end of our time together, sadly. And yet I'm encouraged and energized by this conversation. So I wanted to bring it to you, Stephanie, in terms of a closing excerpt that you wanted to share with us. And then I have about 3 more questions as we close our time together.
That sounds excellent. So I'm going to read a little bit from our conclusion, because one of the big takeaways that we had is that people take risks for what we love, right? And that love is at the core of a lot of the cases that we look at and interactions that people would describe and what we've observed, right? That like actually get rid of that paralysis I was talking about and help get that hope activated, right? And get people feeling connected to others. So I'm going to read a little bit kind of in that direction. For those of you who are following along, I'm starting at the first full paragraph on page 166. This is where insights from scholarship can help with community organizing. Research from within sociology has shown that strong, loving, reciprocal relationships can move mountains, and that community organizations are the driving logistic and organizing forces behind social change. One clear example is the US Civil Rights Movement, which was built on the organizational and community structure of Black churches. All of our case studies show the same thing, that relationships with other humans and with more than humans constitute the core of this work. Indeed, community groups are usually the only forces moving mountains. Politics tend to lag behind community organizing, not lead it. And right now we have some serious mountains that need moving: political, economic, social, ontological, and ecological. The central idea from much sociological research then is that people are much more likely to take risks for the other people, communities, and natural spaces that we love. We will sit in for them, march for them, risk arrest, or run office to ensure a better world for them. And the structures we build around the communities that we love, our congregations, our parenting groups, our neighborhood groups, can be the backbone of the political work that needs doing. Those groups give us strength, fuse our identities to something bigger, hold us accountable, and make logistics easier, in large part because we already care about and trust people within them. In these spaces, the restorative work we highlighted earlier can happen more organically. Non-political groups help build relationships that can be transferred to organizing work, and the power of the people is much more easily evoked when we are fighting for and alongside those we love. Indeed, this may be the secret ingredient in learning to think intergenerationally, expansively, and transformatively. But what do those connections actually look like for most of us? A 2018 study showed that the average American has not made a new friend in 5 years, and that more than 1/5 of people in the US always or often feel lonely, a problem that has recently reached the status of a public health crisis. There are many reasons for this, but it suggests that one of the first and most obvious steps anyone can take is to connect with other people by making new relationships and strengthening existing ones. Have a drink with a colleague after work, write letters for a local political campaign, check on an elderly neighbor, walk your dog with a friend. Global pandemics complicate these efforts, of course, but people's creative innovations for connecting with one another, even amid COVID, have shown us just how determined human beings are to remain social and connected to others. So seek others out. No problem is solved alone, especially not big problems as big as these. Organizing collectives and collective action are at the heart of this. Organizing is a process. It looks a little different from one context to the next, and it has to be done with other people. It is messy, tedious, frequently vexing, and daunting for cultures conditioned to crave instant gratification. But organizing, working with others to change systems, is what defines each case we have presented in this book. At the core of all these organizations, as different as they may be, is people getting together, hammering out a vision for change, and doing the tough work of transforming the world around them for the sake of other people and more than humans. One challenge within sociological, political, and economic environments so focused on humans alone is expanding and evolving that love for others to include not only more people, but also more than human relations. The trick is learning and relearning humanity's connection with the world outside the built environment, and expanding people's thinking to make this part of how teaching, learning, and action happen in all institutions. The task becomes evolving beyond worldviews that emphasize separation from and domination of nature, of perceiving nature as something, quote, out there. It also means fighting the urge to surrender to business as usual, fighting the urge to give up as climate crises and other existential dilemmas encroach from all directions. And then we end with a quote from Potawatomi scientist and writer Robin Wall Kimmerer, who has become quite well known. So I'll let you read that. But really the goal is to avoid despair, because as she says, despair is paralysis. It robs us of agency and it blinds us to our own power and the power of the earth. But how can we submit to despair when the land is saying help? Restoration is a powerful antidote to despair. And so that's why I think we end up with that note. And I think that it's really relates to the question we were just discussing in terms of environmental justice, right? Because it teaches us to think of ourselves as part of a variety of environments, including more than human beings.
Thank you, Stephanie. So there's something we'll end on. That said, these are 3 questions, and you all can take, I think the final question I want both of you to respond to. If you want to divvy up the other 2 questions, we can do that in the interest of time. So the first question of 3 is, what US city and city outside of the US, to your knowledge, has the best and most expeditiously implemented climate change plan, and why they're unique? The second question is, how do you deal with the overwhelming feeling that there's too much to be done? And so this speaks to kind of that feeling of despair, and sometimes we can get locked into that feeling of despair or lack of forward movement and just be stuck. And then for both of you is, so just briefly, one of the things throughout the book, you all is all about healing, healing of ourselves and healing of the earth and more than humans. And so how do you both practice self-care in this work that can oftentimes be daunting and feel like there's too much? So those are the questions on the floor in the next 9 minutes. So maybe even probably 4 minutes so that we can close. No pressure though.
I can take a crack at the first one. And anybody who knows me is like not going to be surprised by this answer. But I think again, I am always hesitant to assign a best. I also think that city level and state level are meaningfully different, and I'm more inclined to thinking about states partly because you can enforce it better. So there are a number of states that have very ambitious climate emissions reductions plans on the books. Rhode Island has one, Maine has one. Maine's just won an award. And it commits us legally to emissions reductions by 2033 in Rhode Island. I think Maine's is, and that's mostly just because we have existing contracts that we have to honor with like energy suppliers. But what that does is holds the state legally, bindingly accountable to its emissions reductions targets, and then makes every agency in the state have to reflect those targets in our planning. So different cities are going to find different ways to do that. And again, like the things that work for Boston are not necessarily the things that work for Denver, and are not necessarily the things that work for New Orleans for lots and lots of different reasons. So again, like part of adaptiveness, I think, infrastructurally and also emotionally and socially, is not having a sort of top-down one-size-fits-all approach to things. It is having structures of accountability that say, you guys do this however you need to do it, but you need to do it. And then cities and towns and communities and states will figure out ways, hopefully, ideally, to do that. That makes a lot of sense. So Rhode Island, we have a lot of ocean. So we have the possibility of a lot of wind power. We have some other struggles around like a very car intensive culture and not great public transit and all kinds of other stuff. Those are our challenges. We're also at sea level. Those are our challenges. Stephanie lives in a very mountainous and a dry region like that. Those things are very different. We do not have oil paths in our backyards. That's not true of a lot of people in Colorado, right? So the things that we do will vary. That said, I am a huge fan of the climate. Rhode Island's is called Act on Climate, but it basically lays out a binding legal infrastructure for saying like we need to get our emissions down by every means that we have, and we need to do it by X date. And those are the kinds of things I think that sort of keep the pressure where it should be in terms of forcing systems and institutions to change, but also enabling communities and areas to do that in a way that makes sense for them. The United States, is a gigantic place, and the realities across the country look really, really different. And I think any policy, I think of them as kind of like macro level frameworks, and then meso level frameworks and micro level frameworks. And there's going to be different interactions between different things. I tend to think that like state level binding agreements are a really great place to start, because states don't need agreement in the federal government to do that. But we can use all the tools that are available to us, both from up, like bigger institutions, bigger levels of government, and community creativity. They can both sort of meet there. I obviously have a bias. That's the place where I work, but I work there for a reason, right? Because I think it is an incredibly generative and promising sort of level of organization.
I'll really quickly add to that. I think I live in a city, Fort Collins, that has a really proactive climate plan in place. And I would say that the state level, I agree with Megan completely, that the state level can be really kind of that useful meso level for a lot of these community organizations and communities to kind of hook into, which we talk about a lot in the book, right? This mycelial structure, as we kind of characterize it. But for example, Fort Collins is reducing our, by 2030, reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 80% below 2005 baseline levels. We want 100% renewable electricity by 2030 with grid and local sources, and achieving zero waste or 100% landfill diversion by 2030 as well. That said, Fort Collins is an incredibly privileged and white community, right? And there are incredible environmental justice and equity issues up and down the Front Range that have to be addressed. But the city has an office of sustainability where they look at social, economic, and ecological sustainability. And so it's a very great example of what works here and now, but can always be improved, right? And made a little better. I think that that idea of multi-level thinking is really important. And so making sure there are spaces at the community, state, and national and international level to hook into. And that's really one of the challenges that quite a few of our case study representatives talked about, right? This idea of like building this really robust organizational structure and these efforts, and then the trick being kind of finding bigger systems to link to that can help make it more, I hate using the word sustainable, but in this context, it makes sense, right? Make it more sustainable and coalition building, right? And fostering kind of that coalition building across those scales, I think is vital. I'll leave it at that to get to the other questions.
Yeah. So So you all kind of answered the second one, how you deal with the feeling of overwhelm. So I will be very pointed. So this is a speed round, y'all. We're going to do this quickly. So like maybe 1 or 2 words of Stephanie, how do you practice self-care?
Be loving nature as much as possible and being outside with my family and loved ones as much as possible. So it's not all doom and gloom.
That's right. I love it. Megan, how do you practice self-care?
I would say loving people hard, using my body really hard, and playing outside.
I love it. Playing outside. So everyone, part of our homework is to play outside today. Last comment is, and then I'll pass it on to Gabriella, unless Gabriella, I'm just closing us out. So someone from one of our guests said, thank you, Megan and Stephanie, for this discussion. Just purchased your book. So yay, we have 1 book purchased today. Hopefully it'll translate into Spanish and German and everywhere else, and look forward to reading it. Thank you for focusing on solutions and what's working. On another note, Rhode Island is lucky to have you as a state senator, Megan. So there you have it. So thank you all for joining us. We really appreciate spending time with you today. There are plenty of other places you could have been and you decided to spend time. I have dropped in the chat if you want to stay connected. We would love to stay connected with you at Sustainable Solutions Lab, so you can join our email list. You can learn more about Sizzle through our website. If you have extra coins in your pocket that are weighing you down, you can always donate because we are a state school, and so we love the green. We love the green outside, and we love the green in our bank accounts too, for this work. And so thank you again, Megan and Stephanie, for taking time to chat with us about your book. Hopefully everyone got the title, Building Something Better, Environmental Crisis and the Promise of Community Change. Grab your copy, grab it for a gift. The holidays are kind of upon us. Everyone needs a stocking stuffer that will inspire hope. And that will tell them what's working out in the world so that we can not succumb to despair, but instead be encouraged to do our part. So do our part collectively, not individually, collectively. Anything else, Gabriella?
You covered it all. What a wonderful event. Thank you to the 3 of you for this robust conversation. Thank you to everyone who was here. And we will be sharing out the resources mentioned and the recording of this event through email.
We're so grateful. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This was really fun.